In 2008, one man's betrayal shattered the lives of thousands, leaving a trail of broken dreams and financial ruin. Bernie Madoff, a name synonymous with the largest Ponzi scheme in history, stole billions from unsuspecting investors. But behind the polished exterior in the world of high finance, there was a far darker truth. This is the story of the man who defied the law, manipulated the system, and destroyed lives. Let's unravel the shocking truth behind Bernie Madoff's infamous Ponzi scheme. Stay tuned, because by the end of this video, you'll know how Madoff managed to deceive the world for decades, the heartbreaking consequences for his victims, and the chilling details of his arrest and downfall. But the real question is, how did a man trusted by the wealthiest people in the world get away with such an elaborate fraud? Let's dive into the truth that no one saw coming. Before the fall, Bernie Madoff wasn't just a figure in finance, he was the figure. He was trusted by everyone from wealthy investors to charitable foundations. His firm, Madoff Investment Securities, was one of the most successful and respected on Wall Street. For decades, Bernie seemed untouchable. But all of that came crashing down when it was revealed that the man who had built his empire on trust was running the largest Ponzi scheme in history, a scheme worth a staggering $65 billion. Bernie Madoff's rise to power in the financial world wasn't just about numbers, it was about trust. Trust is what built his empire, and it was the same trust that allowed him to deceive the world for decades.
Born in 1938 in Queens, New York, Bernie's early life was far from the glamorous image he would later project. He didn't come from wealth, but from a humble Jewish family, and his early days were spent working hard to carve out a place for himself. As a young man, Bernie was determined to make his mark in finance, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him. By the age of 22, he had founded Madoff Investment Securities in 1960, starting with just a few $1,000s. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning of something huge. For a long time, Bernie played by the book. He wasn't just another stockbroker. He was determined to build a reputable firm and grow his business the right way. He worked tirelessly, slowly but surely, making his name known in the financial community. But Bernie had something else working in his favor. He had a knack for reading people. He knew how to win their trust and keep them coming back. Over time, Madoff's reputation started to soar. He wasn't just another trader in the mix, he was a leader in the world of finance. People began seeking him out, not only because of his reputation for delivering steady returns, but because he seemed to offer something that no one else could: stability. In the cutthroat world of Wall Street, Bernie became the reliable guy. As the years went on, he secured high-profile clients, from wealthy individuals to top-tier financial institutions. He even became involved with NASDAQ, the stock exchange he would help found. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Madoff was practically a household name in finance. But here's where the story gets complicated. Madoff didn't just make his money the traditional way. He promised steady, risk-free returns to his investors, returns that no one else could match. For years, he delivered on those promises, and his clients kept coming back. They trusted him, and why wouldn't they? He was running a legitimate, reputable firm that practically radiated credibility. Investors were thrilled with their returns, and the word spread. More and more people started pouring their money into Madoff's hands. The more money Madoff took in, the more trust he gained, and the more people began to believe in his system. The thing is, Madoff wasn't investing that money. While the world saw an ever-growing portfolio of successful investments, Madoff was simply moving money around to keep the illusion alive. He was running a Ponzi scheme, but to the outside world, he was the embodiment of success. Every check he wrote to an investor came from the pocket of someone else. It was a game of smoke and mirrors, and for decades, no one noticed. But how did Bernie keep this secret for so long? How did no one question his success? How did he keep pulling off a scheme that should have been impossible to maintain? The answer lies in the trust he had built over decades. Bernie had mastered the art of deception. He wasn't just trading stocks, he was trading on people's trust. He used his reputation, his charm, and his position in the financial world to distract from the truth. He surrounded himself with the best and the brightest, keeping everyone convinced that what they were seeing was the real deal. People didn't question him because they didn't have to. To them, Madoff was a pillar of stability, someone they could rely on for financial success. But the truth? It was much darker. Bernie wasn't just managing money, he was manipulating an entire system. Behind the scenes, while the world saw returns, he was simply moving the same money around. For years, his scheme went unnoticed because no one wanted to see the cracks in the system. No one wanted to believe that someone with Madoff's reputation could be capable of such fraud. So, how did Bernie Madoff manage to keep the facade up for so long? How did he make billions without anyone questioning him? It all came down to his control over trust, and the fact that, for a long time, nobody could imagine the kind of deception he was capable of. As Bernie Madoff's reputation grew, so did the complexity of his operations. For years, everything appeared perfectly legitimate. His clients were getting consistent returns, his firm was growing rapidly, and he seemed to be the pillar of Wall Street's success. But behind closed doors, the foundation of Madoff's empire was built on a lie. It wasn't just that Madoff was a brilliant businessman. He was a master manipulator, skilled in the art of deceit. By the early 1990s, he had amassed a staggering portfolio, one that attracted everyone from wealthy elites to charitable organizations. The money flowed in like a river, and the more it flowed, the greater the illusion became. But no one knew that underneath the surface, the scheme was starting to collapse. Madoff didn't make his money through legitimate investments. Instead, he used the funds of new investors to pay returns to older ones, a classic Ponzi scheme. The investors, happy with their steady returns, didn't question how Madoff was pulling it off. They had been lulled into a false sense of security, trusting him completely. And it wasn't just the rich individuals that Madoff preyed on. He also went after large institutions. His clients were some of the wealthiest people in the world, including hedge funds, banks, and even major charities. They all believed in Madoff's reputation, and they all trusted him to manage their fortunes. The scheme continued for years, thriving on a constant stream of new investments. Madoff played the game perfectly, keeping his clients happy, keeping up appearances, and maintaining the illusion of success. But as the years went on, cracks started to show. Investors began to ask questions. They wanted to know how Madoff was making these profits. And when they asked, Madoff had no real answers. The truth was simple. There was no actual investing happening. Madoff was moving money around, keeping up the illusion of returns. And when clients came to him asking for their money back, there wasn't enough to give. He was running out of cash to pay the growing number of investors who demanded their payouts. This was when the cracks started to widen. In the late 2000s, the world of finance was on the edge of collapse. The 2008 financial crisis hit, and the economy took a massive hit. Madoff, unable to hide the truth any longer, was suddenly facing pressure from all directions. The floodgates opened as investors began demanding their money back. Madoff had been able to manage his scheme as long as there was new money coming in, but when the crisis hit, he could no longer keep up the facade. The Ponzi scheme, which had been running for decades, was suddenly facing a downward spiral. The amount of money Madoff owed was far greater than what he had. His clients, who had once been ecstatic about their returns, were now starting to panic. And this panic would lead to the unraveling of everything Madoff had built. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out. As more and more people began to realize the scam they had been a part of, the world started to close in on Madoff. But the question remained: how had he gotten away with this for so long? How did he manage to deceive so many for so many years? It wasn't just about the money, it was about the sheer size of the deception, the way he had manipulated not only his investors, but the entire financial system itself. The Ponzi scheme that Madoff had built had started with small promises and innocent trust, but over time, it evolved into something far more sinister. The more he took, the more he had to give. But with each payment, Madoff was building a house of cards, one that would inevitably collapse under its own weight. How could someone with so much power and trust let it all slip away? And what happens when an empire built on lies finally crumbles? As the 2000s rolled on, things began to look different. The money kept coming in, the investors kept trusting, and the returns kept flowing. But behind the scenes, whispers started circulating. For decades, Bernie Madoff had been untouchable, his scheme running smoothly with minimal resistance. But when the global financial landscape began to shift in the early 2000s, something started to feel off. It was small at first. Minor inconsistencies, questions, and rumors from a few cautious investors. The first sign that not everything was as it seemed came when Harry Markopolos, a financial analyst with a keen eye for numbers, started to ask the tough questions. He was one of the first to see the flaws in Madoff's operations, and he didn't just ignore them. Instead, he did what few others dared to do. He started investigating. Markopolos was no rookie. He knew the ins and outs of the financial world better than most. As he dug deeper into Madoff's operations, the more he realized that the returns Madoff promised were mathematically impossible. Yet Madoff continued to impress people with his charm, his smooth-talking persona, and the steady returns he provided. But Markopolos wasn't buying it. He started filing reports and warning the authorities. He sent multiple letters to the SEC, detailing his concerns about Madoff's operation and suggesting that what Madoff was doing was fraud, a Ponzi scheme in plain sight. Yet his warnings went unheeded. Could someone stop the madness before it all collapsed? The answer is no. The whispers grew louder, and it wasn't just Markopolos. Other investors, growing suspicious about their returns, began to ask Madoff some tough questions. But Madoff, as always, had an answer. His responses were calm, convincing, and above all, plausible. He knew how to deflect and how to manipulate the truth. The SEC, the very institution designed to protect investors from fraud, took notice of the growing concerns. They started their own investigations into Madoff's operations. The results? Nothing. For years, the SEC's investigations were limited and ultimately failed to uncover the truth. Madoff's web of lies was so perfectly woven that even the authorities couldn't pierce it. On paper, everything seemed legitimate, and Madoff continued to play his role as the golden boy of finance. And so, despite mounting red flags, the investigations came up empty. The SEC couldn't prove a thing, and for a long time, no one had the courage or the insight to look any deeper. Madoff's charm was just as powerful as his fraud. Madoff's charm was as much a weapon as his deception. No one seemed able to break through his web of lies. The more people tried to peel back the layers, the more he convinced them everything was fine. The year 2008 is etched in history, not only for the global financial crisis, but for how it brought down a man who had seemingly mastered the art of deception. For decades, Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme ran smoothly, but when the world's economy began to crumble, it exposed everything that had been hidden for so long. The crash of 2008 sent shockwaves through the financial world. Banks were failing, stock prices were plummeting, and investors were scrambling to secure their assets. For years, Madoff had promised steady, risk-free returns, and many people trusted him with their life savings. But when the market collapsed, the facade Madoff had built began to falter. As the stock market spiraled downward, investors grew increasingly nervous about their money. They started to demand withdrawals from their accounts, and Madoff, who had been relying on new investors' funds to pay the old ones, could no longer meet these demands. The truth was starting to seep through the cracks. The Ponzi scheme, which had been running on borrowed time, was no longer sustainable. Madoff couldn't keep up the illusion any longer. Suddenly, the house of cards began to crumble. What would happen when the truth came out? Could Madoff escape it all? At this point, Madoff's carefully constructed world was about to fall apart. With no more money to cover withdrawals, the truth about his fraudulent scheme was unavoidable. The pressure was building, and the walls were closing in on Madoff. The empire he had spent decades building was teetering on the edge of collapse. As Madoff's scheme unraveled, it was no longer a matter of when the truth would come out, but how. The final straw came when Madoff's own family turned against him. In December of 2008, as the walls closed in, Madoff confessed to his sons, Mark and Andrew, that the business was a fraud, that he had stolen billions from investors. They had no choice but to report him to the authorities. The arrest that followed was swift, but it didn't come without its own drama. Madoff, the man who had once been at the top of the financial world, was now a criminal, and his fall from grace was about to be made public in the most dramatic way possible. The news broke quickly. Headlines flashed across every news outlet, broadcasting the news of Madoff's arrest. Police lights flashed in the background, and Madoff, handcuffed, was led out of his luxurious Manhattan apartment by officers. The image of the once untouchable financial giant in handcuffs was jarring. It was a moment that felt like the end of an era. The arrest didn't just mark the end of a scheme, it was the start of a global reckoning. This moment wasn't just about Madoff's downfall, it was about the entire financial system being shaken to its core. Madoff's arrest symbolized the collapse of a system that had allowed him to operate for so long. Trust, the very foundation on which his empire was built, was now shattered, and the world was watching as this once untouchable man was led away in shame. The numbers are staggering. $65 billion stolen from thousands of people. But behind those numbers are real stories, real lives, and real devastation. For every person who handed over their money to Bernie Madoff, there was a dream they were trying to protect, and a future they were hoping to secure. The victims of Madoff's Ponzi scheme were business owners, retirees, and even charitable organizations that lost everything they had worked for. The pain of those who were deceived by Madoff goes far beyond financial loss. Madoff didn't just steal their savings. He took their sense of security, their hopes for the future, and in many cases, their livelihoods. Family businesses that had been passed down for generations were wiped out, and retirees who had spent decades saving for their golden years were left with nothing. We hear from Jane, a business owner from California who lost her life savings to Madoff's scheme. She had invested her money into Madoff's firm, trusting him to protect her family's future. But when the Ponzi scheme collapsed, Jane found herself scrambling to hold her business together. I thought I had secured my children's future. Now everything is gone. My business is gone. My savings are gone. What do I tell my kids? Next, we hear from Harold, a retired teacher who had spent decades saving for his retirement. I never thought I'd end up like this. I was supposed to have peace of mind. Instead, I'm 70 years old and I'm starting from scratch. For many of Madoff's victims, their life savings were tied up in his hands. Their dreams were built on the assurance that Madoff's firm was trustworthy and that their futures were secure. The devastation was not just financial, it was deeply personal. The human cost is often lost in the numbers, but the truth is that every person who fell victim to Madoff was affected in ways that went far beyond finances. It wasn't just money that Madoff stole, it was trust, hope, and futures. The emotional toll of his actions is not something Madoff could ever fully comprehend, but for his victims, it was a lifelong scar. While Madoff's victims were reeling from the damage he caused, Madoff himself remained cold, almost indifferent to the destruction he had wrought. His lack of remorse was evident throughout his trial and his public statements. In the courtroom, Madoff's demeanor was striking, calm, collected, and dispassionate. Despite the devastation caused by his actions, Madoff never showed any sign of true regret. He was more concerned about himself than the victims who had trusted him. At his trial, Madoff was given the opportunity to speak. He admitted to the crime, but his words lacked any real empathy. He spoke of his scheme in a detached way, almost as if it were just a business decision gone wrong, not an act that had destroyed lives. "I'm sorry," he said, but the words felt hollow. There was no visible emotion, no recognition of the lives he had ruined. Madoff's apologies seemed like nothing more than a public relations attempt to soften his image, rather than a heartfelt acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. The coldness in his voice when speaking about his victims was palpable. He had no regard for the families left in financial ruin, for the elderly who had worked their entire lives to build something only to see it destroyed in a matter of days. "I have to live with the knowledge that I hurt so many people, but there's nothing I can do to change what happened." Madoff during his trial. His words were chilling. He knew the damage was irreversible, and yet he never truly grasped the weight of what he had done. His actions were about greed and control, not about the people he had trampled on in the process. Do you think Madoff ever truly realized the extent of his betrayal? The day of Bernie Madoff's trial marked the beginning of the end for the Ponzi scheme that had defrauded thousands of investors and shaken the global financial system. His arrest in December 2008 had already sent shockwaves through the financial world, but the trial would be the moment the truth was laid bare for the world to see. Madoff faced charges of securities fraud, money laundering, and perjury, and the courtroom was packed with those who had been affected by his crimes. Victims who had lost their life savings and families who had been torn apart. His defense team tried to argue that Madoff was just a man who made mistakes, but no one was buying that story. The damage was too great and the scale of the deception was too enormous. At the trial, Madoff's demeanor remained as calm and controlled as ever. He sat there in his suit, surrounded by lawyers, and faced the judge without flinching. But this time there was no charm, no ability to deflect. For the first time, Bernie Madoff had to face the consequences of his actions. Justice was finally catching up with him. During the trial, the judge's words were harsh, condemning Madoff for the magnitude of his crimes. The court also heard emotional testimonies from the victims, describing how Madoff had shattered their lives. Some spoke of losing everything, others of broken trust that could never be repaired. The judge was clear. The severity of the crimes Madoff committed warranted the maximum sentence. One victim's testimony was particularly poignant. Bernie Madoff didn't just take our money. He took our trust, he took our peace of mind, and he took our future. He deserves to rot in prison for the rest of his life. The weight of these words filled the courtroom, and on June 29, 2009, the judge handed down the sentence, 150 years in prison, the maximum allowed by law. Bernie Madoff would never see freedom again. 150 years. That's how long Madoff was sentenced to spend in prison for the destruction he had caused. But even with that sentence, many wondered, was justice truly served? Madoff's time in prison was a far cry from the luxurious life he once enjoyed. After his sentencing, he was transferred to the Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina, a medium-security facility. It was a humbling fall from the heights of Wall Street's elite. Madoff, who had spent decades surrounded by the wealthiest individuals, was now in a facility with other white-collar criminals, a stark contrast to the lifestyle he had once enjoyed. For many, it seemed fitting that Madoff would spend the rest of his life in prison. But there was a disturbing reality to his sentence. Despite the 150-year sentence, Madoff only served a fraction of it. Madoff's final years were spent in a relatively comfortable part of the prison. He had access to medical care, and he was known to keep to himself, rarely engaging with other prisoners. He received visits from family and spent his days reflecting on the ruin he had caused. Madoff's life behind bars was far removed from the chaos and destruction he had left behind in the outside world. Madoff thought he could escape the law for decades. In the end, the truth caught up with him. But was justice truly served? The question lingered in the air as Madoff served only 12 years of his 150-year sentence. He died on April 14, 2021, from natural causes, having lived just long enough to see his empire crumble and his legacy tarnished forever. He died knowing that while he had avoided the death penalty, he would never be remembered as the respected financier he once was. Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme didn't just affect his victims. Its ripples were felt throughout the entire financial world. When the scale of his fraud was revealed, it shook the very foundations of the global financial system. The trust that investors had placed in the financial system was shattered, and the regulatory failures that allowed Madoff to deceive so many for so long became glaringly obvious. Madoff's fraud was the wake-up call that the system needed to change. In the aftermath of the scandal, there was a wave of new financial regulations aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Lawmakers and regulators scrambled to address the loopholes that allowed Madoff to operate with little oversight. The SEC, which had failed to catch Madoff despite multiple warnings, was forced to confront its own shortcomings. In the wake of the scandal, new laws were passed to prevent such a massive breach of trust from happening again. These included more stringent requirements for financial firms, including mandatory audits and closer monitoring of investment returns to ensure they were legitimate. The Dodd-Frank Act, passed in 2010, introduced a number of reforms in the wake of the financial crisis. including new whistleblower protections and measures to ensure more oversight of hedge funds, investment firms, and other financial entities. These reforms aimed to close the gaps that Madoff had exploited for decades. And while they didn't prevent every fraud, they were an attempt to ensure that no one would be able to manipulate the system in the same way Madoff did. The scandal also led to the strengthening of investor protections. Financial advisors, who had been largely unregulated before, now faced greater scrutiny, and investors were given more tools to evaluate where their money was going. While these changes couldn't undo the damage Madoff caused, they served as a necessary response to a crisis that showed how vulnerable the financial system had been. Despite the reforms, the damage Madoff caused could never be completely erased. Could Madoff have been stopped earlier? How did a man with so many red flags around him manage to deceive so many for so long? Was it the trust he had built over the years that blinded people to the truth? Or was it the greed of investors who didn't want to ask too many questions, hoping to continue making money without scrutiny? And beyond the technicalities of the law, Madoff's scheme serves as a powerful reminder of the human elements at play in finance: trust, greed, and accountability. Madoff was able to manipulate these elements, using trust to his advantage and feeding the greed of investors who wanted easy returns without digging deeper into how their wealth was being generated. In the end, it wasn't just about the money. It was about a failure of accountability, where people in power failed to question the unchecked growth of an operation that seemed too good to be true. In many ways, the lesson of Madoff's Ponzi scheme is a timeless one. When trust is abused and greed is unchecked, even the most sophisticated systems can collapse. Could Madoff have been stopped earlier? And what does his scheme teach us about trust, greed, and accountability in finance? The Bernie Madoff case is a stark reminder of the power of trust and how easily it can be manipulated. For decades, Madoff was seen as a pillar of trustworthiness in the financial world. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a symbol of security in an industry known for its risks. Yet behind that image was a man who exploited the very trust he had cultivated. He knew that in the world of finance, trust is everything, and it's exactly that trust that allowed his Ponzi scheme to thrive for so long. Madoff's downfall wasn't just about financial manipulation. It was about human nature. People want to believe in success. They want to believe in the promise of easy returns, in the security that someone else is managing their wealth with integrity. But as Madoff showed, when trust is abused, it doesn't just damage the individual, it collapses entire systems. So as we look at the world today, a world dominated by digital finance, cryptocurrencies, and social media influencers, one has to ask, how much trust are we placing in the systems that govern our money? Are we truly questioning the platforms and individuals we follow? Or are we simply trusting too easily, hoping that we won't fall victim to another Madoff-style deception? In a world where we can transfer money in an instant, invest through apps, and rely on digital platforms for advice, how safe is our trust? The question remains, are we just one scandal away from another Madoff? What do you think about the power of trust in today's world of digital finance and social media? Are we just one scandal away from a new Madoff? If you found this story as shocking as we did, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode.